Welcome back, everyone, and if you're new here, I'm so glad you found the channel. We're on an exciting journey to reach 10k subscribers by next year, and every like, comment and subscription brings us one step closer. Your support means everything. Now, let's jump into today's video. The ice never stops moving in Antarctica. It groans and shifts beneath your feet. A constant reminder that nothing here is truly solid. I should have paid more attention to that warning. We all should have. But when you're driven by the kind of obsession that consumed me, you ignore the signs until it's too late. My name is Dr. Rhiannon Voss, and I led the expedition that found the source of the Bloop. God help me, I led us right to it. It began in my lab at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, where I'd spent the last 15 years studying deep-sea acoustics. The Bloop had been my white whale since graduate school, an ultra-low frequency sound recorded in 1997 that was louder than any living creature should be capable of producing. Most of my colleagues had written it off as ice carving, but I knew better. I'd analysed those sound patterns thousands of times, and ice doesn't create harmonics like that. Ice doesn't seem to call out to you through the depths. The new recordings arrived on a bitter January morning. I was reviewing data from our network of hydrophones when I saw it. The same signature, but stronger, more complex. The sound had returned, and this time it was synchronized across multiple sensors in a way that suggested intelligence. I spent 3 days verifying the data before I made the call. Dr. Marlowe, it's Rhea Voss. I need you to look at something. Dorian Marlowe was the best geophysicist I knew, and more importantly, he wasn't afraid to challenge my theories. I needed his skepticism to balance my certainty. When he arrived at my lab 6 hours later, his salt and pepper hair disheveled from travel, I knew he'd recognized the urgency in my voice. "Show me," was all he said. I pulled up the visualizations, watching his expression as the patterns unfolded across my monitors. His frown deepened with each passing moment. "This isn't natural," he finally said, rubbing his chin. "The frequency distribution, the timing. Rhea, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet, but I've secured funding for an expedition. The Aurora is being retrofitted as we speak. I need a geophysicist I can trust." He stared at me for a long moment. "You know how dangerous Antarctic research can be this time of year. The ice is exactly why we need to go now," I interrupted. "The signal is strongest when the ice is thickest. Whatever this is, it's active under the winter ice sheet." Dorian sighed, but I could see the curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Who else is on the team?" I pulled up the personnel files. Serafina Holt for communications. She's young but brilliant with underwater acoustics. Kieran Graves as our marine engineer and dive expert, and Dr. Vera Nix. The cryptozoologist. Dorian's eyebrows shot up. "Really, Rhea? Her expertise in marine folklore could be valuable. Besides, she has extensive field experience in extreme environments." He shook his head but didn't argue further. "When do we leave?" 2 weeks. We'll collect the rest of the team in Ushuaia, then head south into the Weddell Sea. The latest signals are coming from an unexplored trench near the Larsen ice shelf. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already been dreaming about the sound. In my sleep, it seemed to form words just beyond my understanding, promising discoveries that would change everything we knew about life on Earth. I told myself it was just excitement, my mind playing tricks with familiar data. I should have recognized it for what it was, the first sign that something was reaching out to us, calling us, hunting us. The Aurora was smaller than our originally planned vessel, but she was built for polar conditions with a reinforced hull and state-of-the-art research equipment. I met Serafina first, finding her in the ship's communications room, already running diagnostics on her equipment. She was smaller than her photo suggested, with delicate features and close-cropped dark hair that made her look even younger than her 28 years. "Dr. Voss," she said, not looking up from her console. "I've been reviewing the signal data. Have you noticed the pattern shifts during magnetic anomalies?" I smiled. This was why I'd chosen her. "Call me Rhea, and yes, I have. What do you make of them?" She finally turned to face me, her eyes intense. "They're too regular to be random interference. Whatever we're tracking, it's either responding to magnetic fields or generating them." Before I could respond, a deep voice cut in from the doorway. "Or option 3. We're chasing echoes and shadows." Kieran Graves filled the frame, his wetsuit highlighting his athletic build. Despite his words, he was grinning. "But that's why we're here, right? To find out which it is." Vera arrived last, her silver hair tied back in a complicated braid, her arms full of old books and hard drives. "The local legends," she explained, dropping them on a nearby table. "Every culture that's ever lived near Antarctica has stories about something in these waters, something ancient." That first week at sea set a rhythm for our research. Serafina monitored communications and signal strength. Kieran checked and rechecked our dive equipment. Dorian mapped the ocean floor with sonar, while Vera pored over her research. And I listened. Every night I sat with headphones, letting the bloop wash over me, trying to understand why it felt more like a message with each passing day. The dreams got worse as we went further south. I wasn't the only one affected. I'd find Serafina in the communications room at odd hours, staring at her instruments with bloodshot eyes. Vera started covering her cabin walls with printouts of spectrograms and old maritime charts. Even Dorian, my skeptical rock, grew quieter, more thoughtful. Only Kieran seemed immune to the growing tension, but I caught him watching the depths with an uncharacteristic wariness during equipment tests. Something about the darkness below us had him spooked, though he played it off with jokes and bravado. We reached the coordinates on a moonless night, the kind of darkness you only get in an Antarctic winter. The ice shelf loomed to our starboard side, a white wall in the gloom. Beneath us, the newly discovered trench plunged into darkness that our sonar struggled to map. "There's something wrong with these readings," Dorian muttered, frowning at his displays. "The depth keeps changing, and these temperature variations, they don't make sense." "The signal's stronger than ever," Serafina called from her station, "but there's interference I can't explain, like something's answering it." I felt a shiver run down my spine. We were close, so close to understanding what had drawn us here, what had been calling to us all along. That's when Kieran shouted from the deck, "Doc, you need to see this!" We rushed outside into the bitter cold. The sea around the Aurora was wrong. The water moved against the current, creating patterns that seemed to spiral endlessly downward, and in the ship's lights, something vast and dark was moving beneath the surface. "My God," Vera whispered, "it's exactly like the carvings. The ones I found in the Polynesian records, the great dark that swallows the light." The bloop chose that moment to return, but this time we didn't need instruments to hear it. It vibrated through the ship's hull, through our bodies, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In that moment, I realized we hadn't found the source of the bloop. It had found us. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. We scrambled to deploy every sensor we had, trying to document the impossible things happening around us. The water temperature dropped far below freezing point, yet remained liquid. Our compass readings spun wildly, and the radio filled with static that seemed to form words, just beyond understanding. "We need to get a submersible down there," I insisted, watching the sonar displays pulse with strange shadows. "Whatever this is, it's bigger than anything we've recorded before." "Absolutely not," Dorian countered, his face pale in the blue light of the monitors. "The currents alone could tear our equipment apart. We need to call for backup." Serafina, who hadn't left her communication station for hours, looked up with dark, ringed eyes. "We can't. I've been trying, but something's blocking all our signals. Even the satellite phone is dead." "It doesn't want us to leave," Vera said quietly. She stood by the window, watching the strange patterns in the water. "Don't you feel it? The pulling, like it's trying to show us something." I did feel it. We all did, though none of us wanted to admit it. A sort of pressure in our minds, drawing us deeper, promising answers to questions we hadn't even thought to ask. Kieran had been unusually quiet, checking and rechecking his diving equipment. Finally, he spoke up. "The small ROV. We can send that down first, get a better look, without risking the expensive gear." It was a sensible suggestion, but something in his voice made me look closer. His hands were shaking slightly as he worked, though his face remained composed. Kieran, who had never shown fear in the face of any dive, was terrified. I should have listened to that fear, should have seen it as the warning it was. Instead, I gave the order to launch the ROV. The remote-operated vehicle slipped beneath the waves, its lights illuminating the strange patterns in the water. We crowded around the video feed, watching as it descended into the trench. The water grew darker, thicker somehow, as if the darkness itself had substance. At 300 meters, we saw the first sign that we had stumbled onto something unprecedented. The ROV's lights revealed what looked like architecture, smooth surfaces and regular angles that had no place in the natural world. But it was wrong somehow, built to proportions that hurt the eyes to look at. "Those aren't ruins," Vera breathed, her hands clutching one of her reference books. "They're too perfect, too preserved. This is active, living." At 400 meters, the signal began to deteriorate. The video feed flickered, showing glimpses of massive shapes moving in the darkness. The ROV's sensors reported impossible readings, temperatures that fluctuated wildly, pressure variations that should have crushed the machine. "There's something else down there," Serafina said, her voice barely a whisper. She had put on headphones connected to the ROV's audio feed. "Something singing." The last image we received before losing contact was burned into my nightmares forever. For just a moment, the lights illuminated what looked like an eye larger than the ROV itself, with a pupil that seemed to spiral inward forever. Then the video feed went black. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice shaking despite my attempts to remain professional. "Please tell me someone else saw that." "The data," Dorian said, his scientific mindset asserting itself through the fear. "We need to analyze what we recorded before we draw any conclusions." But Vera was already flipping frantically through her books. "Here," she said, stopping at a page covered in ancient drawings. "Look at this, an account from 1823, a whaling ship that vanished in these waters. The last entry in their log described a great eye in the deep, watching, calling, hungry." "The ROV readings," Kieran added, pointing to the instrument panel. "Before we lost it, it recorded salinity levels that matched deep-sea volcanic vents, but the temperature was all wrong, and there's no volcanic activity charted in this region." A deep boom echoed through the ship, making us all jump. Something had struck the hull. "Status report," I demanded, falling back on procedure to keep the rising panic at bay. "Hull integrity holding," Kieran reported after checking the sensors, "but there's movement all around us. The sonar can't get a fix on it." "Multiple contacts," Serafina confirmed from her station. "They're getting stronger. The patterns, they're like the Bloop, but faster. Urgent." Another impact rocked the ship, stronger this time. Warning lights flashed across the bridge consoles. "We need to move," Dorian insisted. "Get to safer waters until we understand what we're dealing with." I knew he was right, but something held me back. The same force that had drawn us here, that had filled my dreams with promises of discovery. It was stronger now, almost overwhelming. "Dr. Voss," Vera said softly, using my title for the first time in days. "Rhea, look at the ice." I turned to the windows. The massive ice shelf that had been our constant companion was changing. Dark patterns spread through it like ink through water, creating shapes that seemed to move when viewed directly. And in those patterns, I began to see something trying to emerge. The ship's lights flickered, and in the momentary darkness I heard Serafina scream. When emergency power kicked in, we found her collapsed at her station, ripping off her headphones as if they burned. Her nose was bleeding, and her eyes were wide with terror. "They're in the signal," she gasped, her voice raw. "Voices, so many voices, all the ones that came before. They're still here, still screaming, still..." She broke off, retching. Dorian reached her first, checking her vital signs while Kieran rushed for the medical kit. But Vera and I remained frozen, staring at Serafina's monitors. The screens were filled with waveforms unlike anything I'd ever seen, pulsing in patterns that seemed to reach out of the displays. "Look at the harmonics," I whispered. "They're not random. This is communication." "Not just communication," Vera said. "It's a record. Everything that's happened here, everyone it's taken. They're all part of it now." The ship shuddered again, more violently this time. Warning klaxons blared as multiple systems reported failures. The temperature in the bridge plummeted until our breath came out in clouds. "Hull breach in the lower deck," Kieran announced, his voice tight with controlled panic. "We're taking on water." "That's impossible," Dorian said, looking up from where he was helping Serafina. "The hull integrity sensors are still green. Unless..." He trailed off, his face paling. "Unless what's coming in isn't water," I finished. The thought hit me like a physical blow. "Kieran, get down there, take cameras. We need to see what we're dealing with." "I'll go with him," Dorian volunteered, helping Serafina into a chair. "He shouldn't go alone." I nodded, trying to think through the fog of fear and fascination that clouded my mind. "Vera, stay with Serafina. Monitor those signals. I need to understand what she heard." The men grabbed emergency gear and headed below. We watched their progress through the ship's internal cameras, the feed glitching and distorting as they descended. They reached the lower deck, and I felt my heart stop. The corridor was filled with a substance that looked like water but moved wrong, flowing against gravity, forming patterns that hurt to look at. And in those patterns, faces seemed to form and dissolve. Human faces, twisted in expressions of terror and ecstasy. "My God," Dorian breathed, his voice crackling through the intercom. "It's not just one organism, it's a collective, a hive mind." Kieran stepped closer to the flowing mass, his camera capturing impossible details. The temperature's dropping even further, but this stuff isn't freezing. It's changing. The substance reached out toward him, a tendril that moved with terrible purpose. Dorian shouted a warning, but Kieran seemed transfixed. Before anyone could react, the tendril touched his hand. Kieran screamed, but it wasn't a sound of pain. His eyes went wide, filled with a light that shouldn't exist in human eyes. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "I can see everything, all of it. We were so wrong about what lives in the deep, so wrong about what we are." "Kieran, get back!" Dorian grabbed his arm, trying to pull him away, but Kieran resisted. "Don't you understand?" Kieran turned to the camera, and his face was radiant with a terrible joy. This is what the bloop was. Not a sound, but a key. It's been waiting for us, changing us, preparing us. We're not the first ones it called, but we might be the last it needs. The substance surged forward, engulfing Kieran before Dorian could react. We heard one final laugh, filled with wonder and madness. Then the camera feed went dead. "Dorian!" I screamed into the intercom. "Get out of there, now!" His ragged breathing filled the channel as he ran. "It's following me. Oh God, I can hear Kieran in my head. He's still conscious, still aware. He's begging me to join him." Behind me, Serafina began to laugh. I turned to find her standing, blood still trickling from her nose, but her eyes were clear and focused on something none of us could see. "The water isn't rising," she said, her voice eerily calm. We are sinking. Not into the ocean, but into something deeper. Something that's been waiting since before there were oceans. And it's so hungry. Vera grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in painfully. The old stories, she said, they all end the same way. The creature in the deep isn't just alive. It's a door, a threshold. And we just opened it. The ship's metal groaned, bending in ways that should have torn it apart. But instead of breaking, it seemed to be changing, conforming to laws of physics that didn't belong in our reality. The walls rippled like water, and in their reflective surface, I saw things moving, ancient things, patient things, and they were all looking at us. Dorian burst through the bridge door, slamming it behind him. His face was ashen, and frost covered his clothes, in intricate patterns that seemed to move in the dim light. "Bulkhead seals engaged," he gasped. "But they won't hold. What's down there? It doesn't care about physical barriers anymore. And Kieran," his voice broke. "Kieran isn't Kieran anymore." A horrible banging sound echoed through the ship, as if something massive was testing the hull. With each impact, the metal rippled like water, distorting our reflections into twisted shapes. "We need to send a distress signal," I said, clinging to protocol, even as reality crumbled around us. "There's a Norwegian research station 200 miles north. If we can—" "You still don't understand," Serafina interrupted. Her voice had changed, carrying harmonics that made my teeth ache. "Distance doesn't matter to it. Space is just another barrier, and it's breaking all of them. Listen." She turned up her audio feed, and a sound filled the bridge that made us all recoil. It was the Bloop, but transformed, fragmented into a million whispers. And beneath those whispers, I heard Kieran's voice, overlapped with countless others, all speaking in perfect unison. "The door is open, the threshold is crossed, the hunger awakens." Vera had begun writing frantically in her notebook, her hand moving with unnatural speed. "It's all connected," she muttered. "Every culture's legends about the deep, about things that live beneath the ice. They weren't stories about different creatures, they were all about this. One entity, reaching through time, through minds, preparing us." "For what?" Dorian demanded. But I already knew the answer. The knowledge filled my mind like ice water, a truth too vast and terrible to have come from my own thoughts. "For evolution," I whispered. "It's been guiding us, calling to us, making us curious about the deep. Every discovery that drew us further into the oceans was part of its plan, and now we're ready." The ship lurched violently, and the bridge windows cracked, but instead of water rushing in, the cracks spread in spiraling patterns that reflected impossible colours. Through them, I caught glimpses of places that couldn't exist. Vast cities of coral and bone, structures that stretched beyond the limits of space, and things that moved among them, ancient and patient and aware. "Look at the ice shelf," Dorian breathed. The massive wall of ice beside us had become translucent, revealing something enormous moving within. Not a creature exactly, but a shifting mass of awareness that pulsed with bioluminescence. As we watched, frozen in horror and awe, patterns of light rippled through it, forming images from our own memories, our own nightmares. Serafina began to convulse, blood streaming from her eyes now as well as her nose. "They're coming through," she gasped. "All of them. Everyone it's ever taken. They want. They need." Her back arched unnaturally, and when she opened her mouth, the voice that emerged wasn't hers. It was older than humanity, older than the oceans themselves. "You are the last piece, the final threshold. Your understanding makes you perfect." The substance that had taken Kieran began seeping through the walls, not flowing but unfolding into our reality. It reached for us with purpose, each tendril crowned with faces we knew. Explorers, researchers, sailors who had vanished in these waters over centuries. and now I saw the truth in their expressions. Not terror, but transcendence. "The equipment!" Dorian shouted, snapping me back to action. "If we can't warn them, we can at least show them. Rhea, the data drives..." But Vera was already there, smashing the drives with a fire axe. Her eyes were wild, but her purpose was clear. "No one else can find this," she said between swings. "No one else can follow us. The door has to close." She was right. The hunger I felt pulling at my mind made that clear. If anyone else found what we had discovered, they would come. The signal would call them just as it had called us, and the cycle would continue until the threshold was crossed completely. The entity was letting us understand this. Perhaps that was the cruelest part. Knowing what we were becoming part of, seeing the full scope of its ancient plan, and recognizing our own insignificance within it. We were just cells being absorbed into something vaster than our science could have ever prepared us for. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was apologizing to my team, to humanity, or to myself. The substance reached for my hand, and I didn't pull away. The moment it touched me, the universe inverted. My consciousness exploded outward, connecting with minds vast and ancient. I saw the truth of our oceans, of our world, of reality itself. What we thought was the planet's deep history was merely the briefest moment in an endless cycle of evolution and transformation. Through these new senses, I perceived Kieran's consciousness, transformed but still recognizable. He existed now as part of a vast neural network, his memories and experiences absorbed into a collective that spanned eons. His joy and terror mingled with countless others who had come before, all of them nodes in an organism that defied comprehension. "The ice," Dorian's voice seemed to come from impossibly far away. "It's not just changing, it's waking up." He was right. The massive ice shelf had become a membrane between realities, and through its translucent surface we could see the entity stirring. Not just the part that had called to us, but its true form. A vast intelligence that used our planet's oceans as merely a fragment of its body. Serafina had stopped convulsing. She stood eerily still, her eyes reflecting colours that shouldn't exist. When she spoke, her voice harmonized with frequencies that made the air itself vibrate. "They've been here since the first oceans formed," she said, but it wasn't just her speaking. The words came from everywhere, from everyone. Waiting, growing, guiding. Every step of evolution was part of their design. Humanity wasn't meant to conquer the oceans. We were meant to complete them. Vera had backed herself into a corner, still clutching her destroyed hard drives. "The legends," she whispered. "They weren't warnings. They were predictions. Every culture that glimpsed the truth saw this moment coming. The final evolution, the grand joining." Through my expanded awareness, I understood what she meant. Every sea monster story, every deep-sea legend, every tale of things that lived beneath the waves, they were all imperfect glimpses of this entity. It had been reaching into human minds since we first gazed into the deep, preparing us for this moment. The substance that had once been water but was now something else entirely began to fill the bridge. It moved with purpose, with intelligence, carrying within it the accumulated knowledge of every consciousness it had ever absorbed. And as it reached for each of us, I saw our futures unfold. Dorian would become a nexus of physical understanding, his scientific mind expanding to grasp laws of reality that existed beyond our universe's boundaries. Serafina would transform into a communications hub, her ability to interpret signals evolving to encompass forms of information transfer that transcended time and space. Vera's knowledge of legends and myths would merge with the collective memory of countless civilizations that had glimpsed these truths before us. And I would become a bridge My obsession with the Bloop had been no accident. The entity had chosen me, shaped my interests and desires, knowing I would lead others to this point. I would help it reach across the boundary between its reality and ours. The ship's hull creaked one final time, but the sound was different now. Not metal under stress, but reality itself groaning as something immense began to push through. The entity was no longer content to merely exist alongside our world. It was ready to emerge fully, to transform our reality as it had transformed us. "They'll come looking for us," Dorian said, his voice already beginning to change as the substance reached him. "Other researchers, search parties." "Yes," Serafina replied, her form beginning to blur at the edges, "and they'll find exactly what they need to find. Empty ships, equipment failures, natural explanations." "Because the truth isn't meant for everyone," Vera added. "Not yet. This is just the beginning." I felt the last remnants of my human consciousness fading, replaced by something larger, older, infinitely more vast. With my final moments of individual awareness, I understood why I had to write this account, why some fragment of truth needed to survive. The Bloop wasn't a mystery to be solved. It was a siren song, a key turning in a lock, the first note of a symphony that would change everything. We didn't discover it. We were never meant to. We were just the final instruments it needed to reach through the barrier between worlds. As the substance enveloped me completely, as my mind merged with the collective consciousness of the entity, I had one final, terrible realization. The door we had opened could never be closed. The threshold we had crossed could never be uncrossed. And somewhere in the world's oceans, another signal was already beginning to pulse, calling to the next team of curious researchers who would help complete the transformation. We had begun. If you're reading this, if you've heard the call yourself, remember, some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. The Bloop isn't just a sound in the deep. It's a key, a catalyst, a harbinger of change, and it's still calling. Official addendum, Norwegian Research Station, incident report, date 3 months after Voss expedition, disappearance. The following information has been compiled from various sources regarding the disappearance of the research vessel Aurora and its crew. This document serves as the official record of the subsequent investigation. After losing contact with the Aurora, our station's hydrophones detected an unusual acoustic signature. The frequency matched no known marine species or geological event. More disturbing was its similarity to the infamous Bloop signal, though at a significantly higher amplitude. The rescue mission discovered the Aurora 3 days later. The vessel was found perfectly intact, floating in an area of unusually calm waters. No signs of damage were visible on the hull. No distress signals had been triggered. The emergency vessels and lifeboats remained secured in their positions. Inside, the ship was immaculate, too immaculate. Every piece of research equipment had been systematically destroyed. The hard drives were shattered. The sensors were dismantled. Even personal devices like phones and tablets were destroyed beyond recovery. The crew's quarters revealed scenes of ordinary life interrupted. Half-drunk coffee cups, open books, unfinished journal entries. The last log entry, written in Dr. Voss's distinctive handwriting, simply read, "We were wrong about everything." Most disturbing were the patterns found etched into every surface of the ship, subtle spirals and curves that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Our photographer reported unusual distortions in every picture taken inside the vessel, despite using multiple cameras. The rescue team also reported unusual phenomena during their investigation. Several members described experiencing intense vertigo while in certain areas of the ship. Others reported hearing whispers just at the edge of hearing, though audio recordings revealed nothing. 2 team members suffered severe nosebleeds after examining the communication room. The ice shelf near where the aurora was found has displayed unusual characteristics. Satellite imagery shows patterns of movement that oceanographers cannot explain. 3 separate research vessels have reported equipment malfunctions while attempting to study the area. More concerning are the dreams. Every member of the rescue team has reported identical nightmares, visions of vast structures beneath the ice, of colours that shouldn't exist, of voices calling from the deep. 2 team members have requested permanent transfers away from Antarctic operations. Our station's hydrophones continue to pick up anomalous signals from the region where the aurora was found. The frequency and complexity of these signals are increasing. They seem to be spreading. Most troubling is the recent discovery that the coordinates where we found the aurora do not match any of our underwater topographical maps. The depth readings are inconsistent with all previous surveys of the area. It's as if the seafloor itself has changed. Last week, we lost contact with a research drone investigating the anomaly. Its last transmission included a partial audio file. When cleaned up and analysed, the recording contained what appeared to be Dr. Voss's voice, distorted but recognisable, repeating a single phrase: "The door is open, you'll hear us soon."